everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Albanian Community Mental Health Podcast. We are so excited to finally be launching this series. I am Dr. Arela Agako.
And I'm Dr. Adile Nexha. We're so happy that you're here with us. This podcast really has been a long time coming, something that we've talked about a lot, that we've envisioned and held close to our hearts. And we're glad to finally be able to get it out there for you guys.
And it feels particularly special to do this podcast with you, Ada. I think me and Ada have known each other for almost 7 years at this point. We met when we were both doing our grad school. So I was doing my PhD in clinical psychology, and Ada was doing her PhD in neuroscience. And as soon as we learned that we were both Albanian, we became friends just like that.
Yeah, and one of our first conversations was probably about the struggles that we face in our community, in our families. I'm just bonding on the fact that, we have this cultural commonality of how we experience mental health. And because we were both in the mental health field, it was just a natural connection that we formed. And since then, we've had sporadic conversations about our culture and mental health that go really deep, that address probably some of the most longstanding structures that we have in our community around mental health. And this is why it's a long time coming to create a podcast like this, because the stuff that we'll talk about here is just an expanded version of our normal conversations that we have.
Yeah, I think from the moment I met Ada, especially since we were in the mental health field, we started talking about the role of our culture and how we grew up and our personal histories with mental health, which we're happy to share with you. And one of the things that we've talked quite a bit about is the stigma that we have. It's so hard for us to open up to one another when it comes to mental health. And because there's so much stigma, then we don't end up seeking the resources that we need. A lot of us suffer in silence. And I remember when I was first talking to Ada about my personal mental health journey, which is kind of what led me to becoming a clinical psychologist, it was the first time that I felt truly understood by someone else because we grew up in a very similar way, because we moved here around the same age. I just immediately felt wow, I'm not alone in all of this. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast, because we're hoping that by listening to our stories, by listening to other people that we're going to have on this podcast and listening to their stories, we can normalize mental health a bit more. We can talk about it more openly, and more importantly, actually seek help when we need it.
Yeah, very well said. Well, I want to start this episode, this first introductory episode, just to talk a little bit more about ourselves, so our listeners have an idea of who we are and how we came to be in this position of founding the Albanian Community Mental Health Organization. So let's start off with you, Arela. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your professional background, and what your relationship has been and has been transformed into within the Albanian community.
Yeah, so I am originally from Tirana. So I grew up in Tirana until I was 12 years old. Me origin jam nga Çamëria. I moved here around grade 7, and one of the things I remember was just how hard it was to move to a new place where you don't understand the language. I didn't speak a word of English, and for that reason, especially moving during that age, kids don't really understand that another kid doesn't speak their language. So unfortunately, I had a lot of experiences with bullying, which definitely just shot my confidence. They made me really introverted. That was the first time in my life that I experienced anxiety. I started experiencing a lot of social anxiety. It was so hard at one point where I remember in high school, I would be in these social settings and I had something called, well, now I know the term, it's called selective mutism, which happens in
Yeah.
kids. But back then, I thought I was going crazy. It was this feeling that I couldn't get a word out. I was so anxious that I physically couldn't speak. Later on, I learned it was one of the symptoms of anxiety. So if anyone has been in a similar situation before, I just really want to normalize it, especially as kids. We're not really aware of what's happening internally in our families. Our parents don't really know what anxiety is or try to conceptualize it in that way. So I would talk to my parents about it, but they didn't understand. So one of the ways in which they would try to support me was, well, it's not that big of a deal. Why would you be anxious in a social situation? Like, no one is judging you. It's all in your head. And I can see now that, they were coming from this really good place of trying to support me, trying to get me to overcome my anxiety. And it had like the opposite effect where I just felt such an intense shame and I genuinely thought there was something wrong with me. I think after high school, I think as I grew up, I kind of learned more coping tools on my own. The internet is a wonderful resource, and I'm glad that the Gen Zs and younger generations have more access to these resources because
Although
when I
I
was
think
growing,
we need to also be careful about the resources that we
yeah,
access.
a
Just,
thousand percent.
being aware of how credible something is when you read it.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of blog posts that tell you how to deal with mental health. AI also,
Yeah.
ChatGPT is very popular. So just be discerning about what kind of advice that you take. And at the end of the day, we're big proponents of seeking help professionally from somebody
Mhm.
who's trained on how to administer mental health.
Yeah,
Thanks.
which is why we're actually starting this podcast because we want to make sure that the resources we give to the public are resources that we know work, we know
Right.
aren't going to make your mental health worse. We know that they're actually going to improve it just because like there's like the research to back it up as well. So for me at the time, it was actually really hard to find the resources that I needed because A, there wasn't a lot that was being talked about when it came to mental health. And B, as a kid, you don't really know where to look. So some of
Yeah.
the things I found were really helpful, and some of the things they were now being a psychologist, I know that they weren't like the most helpful things. So I remember my anxiety kind of festered, and I learned some coping tools, but it was still there underneath the surface. And I remember when I started university, so I wanted to go into law because obviously, if you're Albanian, you're going to go into math, engineering, or law, especially as a girl, or teaching. So I started psychology and criminal justice. I wanted to work with human rights law because I was like rah 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 about human rights. And as I started taking more psychology courses, I just really saw myself in a lot of the things that I was learning. And that was the first time in my life where I was like, hey, like what I'm actually going through, I don't have to feel this way for the rest of my life. There is like a treatment to this. Like there's things that I can be doing to get rid of the anxiety. I don't just have to stuff it down. And by that point, I'd gotten really, really good at stuffing it down. And the more I learned about psychology, the more I fell in love with it. And the more I started thinking, like, wow, how many other people out there are actually suffering in silence in the same way that I have been this whole time? How many people out there just feel this intense shame when it comes to talking about how we're feeling? Because like at the time I thought I was losing my mind. Like I thought I was crazy. I thought there was something wrong with me. So stuff it down, don't let other people see it. And that was the first time in my life where I started taking my mental health more seriously. I started reading a lot more about it. And I decided to actually switch tracks. So I decided to switch from law into clinical psychology. And I remember in grad school, it was early on in my grad school career that I actually met Ada as well. And again, like I go back to that, it was the first time that I felt like I could openly talk about these things. And I had gone to therapy before, but I think there's something different about talking about it with a friend who's also sharing similar experiences versus talking about it with a therapist who is just there to help you and it's really helpful. But there's something very different about someone being able to relate to you in the same way. So for me, that was very, very special. And it
Yeah.
was very healing in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think this is a great place to mention the importance of cultural knowledge when it comes
Mhm.
to receiving or giving mental health help. This is a very big part of what shapes our identity, who we are, and what we think about the world, and how we show up in the world as well. So, you could be receiving really specialized, validated therapeutic help from somebody who is knowledgeable in their field, but if they are not able to accommodate your culture into the way that they administer this therapy, it could be missing a really big mark. And at that time that we met, I think Arela, she was in a clinical training program. I was simply doing PhD research without any clinical training. So I didn't have any background in facilitating any kind of mental health concerns. I was being a friend essentially, but still it was that cultural piece that we shared together that helped us feel so understood between each other, even without any of the expertise that come with being a mental health professional.
Yeah. And I remember too some of those early conversations that we had. Like, I had friends who were also clinicians who were doing trainings in clinical psychology. So we would constantly talk about our struggles. Like, I would talk about my anxiety, they would talk about their anxiety and other things that they had gone through. But there was something so special about being able to tie our anxiety to some of these common experiences that we've had as a population, as a country. So, talking, for example, about like our upbringing, right? Talking about how, the Civil War of like 97 affected us. Talking about how the fall of communism and growing up within that context, how that actually shaped the way that we perceive the world and what causes us anxiety and what causes us pain to this day. So up until that point, I had never had anyone who could like match those experiences with me. They had their own struggles, but I think there was something so important to have this shared understanding of this is what we're suffering with, this is how it shows up for us, and this is actually why, because of these things that we've experienced. These things don't come out of nowhere. They're usually shaped by the way that we've lived our lives.
Absolutely.
And also the coffee cup readings definitely helped to smooth the conversation.
Yeah, we've veered into some spiritual practices at some point. But
That
it's
was
funny
my
that you
favorite.
mentioned that because yes, it could be esoteric in nature to
Mhm.
do these coffee cup readings, but really if you think about the history of sitting down, having coffee with somebody, and then reading their cup to tell the future or to talk about some aspect of their life, it just is another method of communication and connection because I don't know, everybody has their own version of how they read the coffee cups, right? But in my immediate family, in my circles, the way that we do it is we think about an area of our life, press it, and then read what comes up there. And then at the end, after the whole cup is read, we then talk about all of those different things. So this is where the beauty of it comes in. And I think this is where we bonded even more because we talked about so many things and our conversations took us to so many places because these coffee cups readings covered major areas of life like family, work, romance, self-development. They were all encapsulated in different questions or themes that came up in those coffee cup readings. And our conversations got so much deeper and richer because it was just a bonding experience. Yeah. I imagine our ancestors, specifically our female ancestors, sitting around in these circles to talk to each other about their days. At that point, they had kind of who was around them. Nowadays, we have larger social media based circles that we can access. But back then, it was only the people that you had in your vicinity. So I can imagine them sitting around and reading these coffee cups as a way of connecting with each other and sharing stories, talking about the lives that they lived before marriage and things like before children and things like this. So it's really a beautiful tradition that's passed down as a method of connection. I value that one so much.
Yeah, and I think we talk about culture in the way that it affects us and sometimes like harms us. There's parts of every culture that can be harmful. And we also want to talk about it in terms of like the beautiful things that it offers to us. And like the coffee cup readings, there is something so special about that ritual when it comes to talking openly about your hopes and dreams and where you think life is going to go. And there's something very healing in that tradition in and of itself. And there is something about kind of going back to some of these cultural roots that is very healing when it comes to our mental health. And we've experienced it firsthand through some of our discussions back then as well.
Absolutely.
So that's a little bit about my personal journey. Ada, how about you? Can you tell the audience a little bit about how you decided to pursue an education in mental health and what has helped shape your mental health over the years as well?
Yeah, sure. Starting off from my roots, I also was born in Albania and Chypria. I'm from Lushnja. I believe my origins are in Dibra, but this is like conversations that we have with the family about exactly what happened. There's not so many clear records. And we immigrated to Canada when I was 9 years old, so this was grade 4. Again, very similar experience to you, Arela, with the not knowing English. You know, kids are relentless. Bullying was a big part of my first few years here as well, and it really shaped how I think about how I would fit in this society. And for me, the way that this showed up, to compare to how you experience it with the selective mutism, for me it was extreme overperformance, like the need to prove my worth, essentially to prove that I belong here, that my parents made the right choice by immigrating, and it wasn't all in vain. I subconsciously set out on this journey to be the best that I possibly could be. And in that time as a child, the way that you could do that is through academic performance. And this is kind of it was my escapism, my numbing kind of mechanism to escape the hurtful things that I felt at that time, with the family struggles of immigration, the social aspects of it, the fact that our family was so far away and I was kind of plucked out of Albania and set out into this new country where I had no family. And at that time, back in 2005, we didn't have the access to video calls and phone calls like we have now. We used to have those calling cards.
I remember the calling cards.
Awful, where you would pay like, I don't know, $5 for a calling card and speak maybe 2 minutes to your family. Broken signals as well, like you barely got 2 sentences out. It was heartbreaking. I mean, thinking of it now, thinking back then, it was heartbreaking. At that time, it just was what it was. But still, it just shaped the way that I show up in this world. And the need to prove myself was so strong. I excelled academically. I mean, both my parents were professors in Albania, so I think that kind of like shaped how they taught us about the importance of education. But absolutely
I can also imagine, though, that especially because my parents were also very career driven in Albania, I can imagine how much pressure that actually must have put on you growing up, right? Because there's this idea that, they've sacrificed so much, they were able to achieve so much regardless of like all these horrible things that have happened to them in life. So I think that creates like this internal pressure to, hey, I actually have to
more.
overperform at such a level because I've had it easier than them, that I have to achieve more than they ever did. And that pressure just creates a lot of anxiety.
An extreme amount. And this was kind of drilled into us, not just by our parents, but by everybody. One of the biggest reasons, or probably the reason that there is an Albanian diaspora that's so large at this point, is because people are leaving Albania to find better opportunities elsewhere. So this idea of escaping the Albanian structure to go to a better place, quote unquote, with more opportunities, was something that I heard everywhere around me, not just from my parents, from my family, and kind of to justify, like, it is very lonely over there. It's going to be a huge adjustment to immigrate, but we're doing it for the greater good. And so, feeling like if I didn't live up to that expectation of what was meant with this immigration journey, then what was I doing? I would be a failure and the whole thing would be, for nothing. So that was what created so much pressure within me, which I think in some aspects, drove me to really great places. I mean, I'm here. I pursued the PhD where I met you. So in one way or another, life's journey just takes you where it's meant to take you. But that's not to say that we don't struggle sometimes on the way there. So this is how I struggled with anxiety. Anxiety is my primary struggle as well, just the same as yours. But in the sense that I was a perfectionist and overachiever, and I would sacrifice so much of myself just for something to show for it. My mental health, my physical health suffered quite a bit throughout, since I came here in grade 4 up until university and grad school, where I would be constantly neglecting aspects of my well-being for the sake of working, and achieving good grades and making it, higher and higher and higher. So this eventually was not sustainable. At some points, I recognize the havoc that it was wreaking in my life, even if I didn't really have the tools at that time to address it and understand what was happening, which again was one of the reasons why our conversations helped me so much, because I felt understood in what I was experiencing, like why I was trying so hard to achieve these great things. It put some perspective on the trajectory of my life. And then at some point also I received mental health care through a therapist to understand the roots of my anxiety, how to address the anxiety, and how to find better coping mechanisms. And that's helped a lot. I didn't have a therapist with cultural knowledge of Albanian, so I think that part was, it definitely would have been a richer experience if my therapist had had that context, but still to understand about mental health from somebody who didn't know too much about it at all, it helped quite a bit. And just like you know, going into a career of law, I also was going to go into one of those major, top 3 types of careers that's expected. I was about to go to medical school before I had kind of a moment of self-reflection in a way that I've never had before. And I had a really big realization that this is not really it for me. I don't really remember what happened at that time, because it was such a big juxtaposition between who I was and who I wanted to be that I kind of blacked out for a second and I wasn't aware of what I was experiencing. But at some level, I realized that it's not what I wanted to do. So I went into research to find out more about mental health, kind of as a way, as a bridge as well towards finding out where I fit in terms of the career that I wanted. So it just led to this, where I'm now training to be a psychotherapist and I have research backgrounds as well, and kind of melding the 2 careers together to create something like the Albanian community mental health, something that maybe this is how it was meant to be the whole time. It's an unusual career path, I would say, at least in the way that our ancestors would see it, because it's not a linear progression of career. But I think this is the beauty of it, because you get to bring different things that you learn from different roles, and now you can create something as unique as the ACMH organization.
Yeah, I don't think our ancestors had mental health treatment in mind for us. I actually remember when I decided to go into psychology, my grandparents calling my mom and basically being like, "You have failed as a parent. How could you let your daughter go into such a field?" And from their perspective, like, I wasn't offended because I understand it. To them, like, this is like such like a voodoo kind of practice. It's not a real science. And there's like this fear, like, is she actually going to be okay going into this career? Is she going to be able to support herself at the end of the day? And I think it's just because like we don't talk openly about these things.
Absolutely.
I do want to go back a bit to this idea of accomplishment, because I think there's a lot of times in my life, and I'm sure it's the same for you, Ada, too, where people look at how much you've achieved and it's kind of like, well, it doesn't matter what you've gone through because like this is where you've gotten. So all of like the struggles, like, and all of these things, like, well, you got like your PhD, like you're doing so well, like you've achieved so much. And I want to go back to this idea that we don't want to be all or nothing in the way that we describe things. So, yes, some of the ways in which our parents pushed us was really effective because it did lead us to achieving as much as we have. And at the same time, it didn't have to come at the expense of our mental health. And one of the things that I've actually learned is we can achieve a lot more if we're actually balancing it out with taking care of ourselves. And I think in our culture, there's this idea that in order to be successful, you must really kill yourself. Like you must really suffer and not sleep and sacrifice all of these things. And what I've noticed in myself, it's the most I've accomplished has actually been post grad school in terms of like the things that are truly meaningful to me. And post grad school is when I've had the most amount of sleep. I sleep 9 to 10 hours a night, and that's a non negotiable for me. Yeah. Otherwise, I can't function.
That's amazing. That's good. Yeah, you see, I think this is a big conversation to have, a very important conversation to have, because we see so much, at least, in my family, how much people work and they believe, and maybe this is true in some capacity, that the amount of exertion that you put into your work reflects what you get back from it. But I think putting energy into one area of your life and neglecting other areas of your life creates an imbalance that over time is feeding into this chaos that is not
Yeah.
sustainable. So to understand the importance of working, which, it is a big part of our society at the moment to work and to contribute. So of course I understand the importance of that, but what I didn't grow up learning, which I think was a missing piece, was how to take care of myself, and not just in terms of physical things like nutrition and, having a roof over my head, hygiene. Like those are very common things to learn from your parents, which I think our culture does a really good job of because it's expected. But mental health wise, we don't know too much about it. And I don't think I've ever been asked by my parents, at least when I was a child, like, how am I doing? How are things going? Just to get a perspective of how I live my everyday life. But I have been asked, how's school? How are your grades? Did you graduate with honors? Like these kinds of important things that they thought were important at that time. And it definitely created an imbalance that came to bite me a little bit later.
Yeah. And sometimes, in clinical psychology, not just in the Albanian community, but in general, there's this idea like, oh, you young kids, you just blame the parents for everything. And part of this podcast, and what we really want to be mindful of, is that we're approaching this in terms of understanding rather than blame. So we want to understand what are some of the ways in which we've been raised that actually impact us, and also understand why our parents had to raise us in the way that they did. Primarily because our parents' generation, they grew up in communism. They grew up with wars. They grew up with immigration. They grew up with all the discrimination that comes with immigrating to like a new place. So they were constantly in survival mode, and they didn't have the luxury to be able to actually check in with themselves to see how am I doing. They learned that in order to survive, I do have to sacrifice at this level. And they really did. Like for them, they didn't have the luxury to talk about mental health. They didn't have the luxury to slow down. I remember when we first moved to Canada, my dad was working 3 jobs. Like he would literally like come home, sleep for a couple hours, go to like the night shift, come home, sleep for a couple hours, go to the day shift. And it was this intense sacrifice just in order to get the basic needs met, just so there was food on the table. So of course, this is what they passed on because that's what they themselves like have learned. And I think we're like the generation that has grown up in a safer environment. I don't want to say safe because no environment is fully safe and we have our own struggles, but we have grown in a safer environment than the previous generations. And we do have the opportunity to tend to both our mental health, tend to both our physical health as well, because mental health and physical health aren't that different from one another, and accomplish things at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or in the same way that it was for our parents. And I also understand why our parents had to raise us in the way that they did.
Yeah, you touched on a really important point that's going to be interwoven in a lot of our podcast episodes, which is the concept of intergenerational trauma. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, is kind of the process that Arela described, where the patterns that we have are some things that we've taught from our parents and the way that they lived their life and the experiences that they had that shaped their identity, which is the same from their parents that get passed down from generation to generation. So this concept of environmental trauma, like communism, for example, or civil wars, or poverty, or genocides that our population in general, Albania and Kosovo and diaspora, have faced over the years, all have shaped the way that we live in this world. Of course, I commend our parents for their capacity to survive in those types of environments. I can't imagine what it's like living under communism, although I've heard stories and I've seen documentaries. I've read things about what it's like, but still, to live in that space, to fear for your life, is something that's very terrifying, and of course would take anybody out of the state of free flowing and creation and plunge them right into survival. So if that is the mentality that you grew up with, which, our parents' generation grew up pretty much their entire life until very close to immigration, they grew up in the communist era. To grow up with that mentality, of course, is going to shape you in a certain way, just like us growing up in a Western society through immigration shaped our mentality in this way. And, the way that we teach our kids is going to be a result of what we have learned through our experiences. So I think it's about finding a good balance for the appreciation of how your parents and their parents' journeys have shaped how they think about the world and what they pass on. And then also understanding which parts of those patterns you get to choose to move forward, and which one of those you decide to break because you realize that they're not productive and they might even be harmful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. I want to go back to this idea of culturally sensitive therapy because I think it's so important. And I'm not sure what your experience was like, Ada, but I remember I went through a few different therapists before I found one that was actually a really good fit. And they weren't Albanian just because there aren't a lot of Albanian therapists in the area, at least like there wasn't back then. But I remember it was like the first like therapist who considered like the role of culture and asked me questions about how I wanted to live my life. Like what was important to me about my culture, how I wanted to, what was my role in the family versus just assuming that my values were the same as like the more
Mhm.
Western values, for example. And I remember feeling very misunderstood in therapy because I would talk to them about things that we do in Albanian culture. For example, a common one is like, of course, I have to call my mother every single day when I'm living abroad. Like, this is just part of the culture. Like, of course, I have to go home like once a week, even when I was living in Hamilton. My parents are in Toronto. Of course, I have to go home and visit my family because this is like not only an expectation, but I'm close with my family.
Mhm.
And even something as basic as that, some of the therapists weren't able to understand because it was, well, you
Mhm.
have to like set boundaries with your parents and you have to do this and you have to do that. And I'm like, but this is how I also want to live my life. It's not that my parents are forcing this on me. This is how the Albanian community operates. And sometimes, like, I would share things about, the post communism time that I grew up in. And there was like this, like, lack of understanding, almost like a blank stare that didn't invite you to actually speak more about those experiences. And for me, I knew deep down inside, like, hey, something about, some of the things like I watched growing up, for example, like during like the 97 chaos, that I'm like, I feel like they still like affect me. I have a sense that they affect me, but I felt like I could never actually openly talk about it in therapy. And the therapist didn't ask because they didn't have that cultural understanding. So I
Mhm.
think it's so important to have a therapist that really understands the culture and at the same time who can call out the harmful parts of the culture as well.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes, especially more Canadian therapists, they want to provide culturally sensitive care. So they almost like validate the harmful parts of the culture as well. And I
Mhm.
think someone who is more from your culture just has like a little bit more leeway way to criticize the culture versus a Canadian. Like I would get so offended if a Canadian therapist said anything about the Albanian culture, but we call out Albanian culture all the time as well, and it feels very different.
Yeah, I agree. I think there comes some credibility with it being your own personal lived experience that you
Yeah.
can criticize in a way that, you feel it's very funny though, because then if let's say a Canadian or non-Albanian therapist were to criticize in the same way, we would take it as like, well, who are
So
you to talk
offensive.
about my culture? So it's so interesting that we're both protective and critical of the same aspects of our culture, which I think is a very healthy place to be
Mhm.
because you can learn what you want to appreciate and what you want to let fade away with your generation. Like you don't have to pass that on to your children or nieces and nephews or whoever else.
And I'm sure we also have our own biases that we don't see as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, both were soon to be clinician and Arela currently is a clinician. The way that we would address our clients' needs as well needs to be culturally informed because not
Mhm.
only do we live in Canadian society, but we have our own Albanian biases in the back of our minds. So we need to be aware of how receptive we are to somebody else's culture that most
Mhm.
likely is very different from the two that we know. So that's an important
Yeah,
part
absolutely.
of administering care in any capacity. But I think this is a great segue into talking a little bit more about the Albanian Community Mental Health Organization because precisely this topic that we're discussing right now is why we created the Albanian Canadian Community Mental Health Organization, to address the needs of Albanians in Canada, but it's become bigger than that at this point, of Albanians anywhere, to understand their mental health concerns and to address them in a way that's culturally appropriate. Arela, since you had this brilliant idea of creating, absolutely brilliant idea of creating Albanian community mental health, can you tell us a little bit about what your thought process was as you were thinking of this organization, and what realization of a problem or some kind of gap that you were hoping to address in our community led you to create this beautiful organization?
Yeah, so the organization was born actually January of 2025. So it's been about a year, which I can't believe it's only been a year just because of how much we've actually done. And the way it started was very spontaneous. I remember I was going through my registration as an autonomous psychologist in Ontario. And during the application process, it asks you to list like any languages that you speak. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I can write Albanian. I can work with Albanian clients. Like, I would love to work with Albanian clients. And then as a curiosity, I was like, let me see if I can connect with other Albanian psychologists here in Ontario. Maybe we can do something together. I would love to learn from them. And when I looked through the college's registration, who else had put Albanian, it was only me as a psychologist for adults, and there was also Dr. Gadiola Musabeliu, who only works with children and adolescents. So outside of like the two of us, there was no one else. So then I got even more curious. And I was like, okay, let me look at the other provinces. So I went through all the different colleges of all the different provinces, and I did not find another single Albanian psychologist that was registered as a psychologist in those provinces. So in that moment, I mean, there was a little bit of pride. I was like, wow, like I've been able to achieve something that not a lot of people do. And up until that point, I hadn't realized the achievement in and of itself. And at the same time, there was this deep sadness that, hey, these experiences that I had as a kid, these experiences that I've struggled with, I wonder how many other people in our community struggle with the same things. And clearly, there's not enough mental health resources. And then I remember doing the interview with Pastora Shqiptare with Ilirlena, who was kind enough to offer me this platform. And then I just got flooded with so many people actually reaching out to me about therapy in Albanian. At some point, I had a wait list that was like almost like a year long, just because I couldn't keep up like with the demand. And that's when I realized like, hey, we have to do something different here. And that's how ACMH was born. So initially it was just born as a clinical service that I wanted to give people therapy. But then it kind of took a life on its own. Like, I had more volunteers, like George reached out, Dea reached out, Yusra reached out, Miriam reached out. And then I was like, it would be really cool because one of the challenges I was having with clients at the time is that we have all of these Western treatments that have been studied in the Western context, and we know work in the Western context. But when I was applying the same techniques to clients from the Albanian community, it just wasn't landing in the same way. And I felt really lost because it's like I've been taught all of these tools, but then the tools that I'm using don't seem like the better fit. So that's when Ada also joined us finally as ACMH. I managed to convince her to become a co-founder for
It
the
didn't take too
clinic.
much convincing, please don't say it.
You had
Because
to think about it for a while. It was a very anxiety-provoking couple of weeks.
It's only because I just have multiple roles at the same time,
Yeah.
but I had to make space. It's like the other roles, although they are important in my journey towards becoming a clinician scientist, this is a passion project. Like, this is getting goosebumps just talking about it because it hits so close to home. It is home, literally. It's home, exactly. And it's in both of our hearts. So, you know, when you talk to me about being research lead and co-founder of the company, there was no other way but to do it like this, because I think both of our combined skills are the reason why we've gained such traction and probably going to be overshooting the next few years, because it's an innovative organization. We haven't seen any other kind in the world doing what we're doing in terms of clinical expertise and research as well. So we have very high hopes that it's going to inspire other organizations to join our initiative for mental health. And then not only address Canadians, but the diaspora at large, and then hopefully as well begin some initiatives for mental health care and research in Albania. There are definitely some brilliant clinicians in Albania offering mental health care, but to be honest, we still have a long way to go in terms of offering and discovering the needs of mental health
Yeah.
concerns in Albania.
And that's the thing, there just hasn't been studied, right? Like, we just assume that the mental health needs of Albanians are going to be the same as the mental health needs of the Western society. That has been studied quite extensively. And I think what we're noticing clinically and talking with other Albanian clinicians, what they're noticing as well is that there is something that we're missing. So that's how the research component of ACMH started. And we're in partnership with McMaster University. We're trying to apply for some funding because right now it's like a purely volunteer initiative that we're doing. And unfortunately, projects like these do require a lot of funds. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to get some funding through some of the different avenues that we're pursuing right now. And we really want to study what are the needs of the Albanian community, whether in the diaspora, whether back home, and then be able to adapt our treatments so they're a bit more effective when it comes to the Albanian community.
And we're definitely aware of the barriers that people
Yeah.
face when it comes to receiving mental health care, not only in terms of stigma, which is something that we're aiming to address with ACMH and this podcast. Stigma is a very big part of our mental health in our community. So, you know, understanding where the stigma lies and openly discussing some topics like we did today about our own mental health,
Mhm.
but then expanding into some topics that some people may even consider taboo and thought that would never be discussed in an open platform. This is our aim with this podcast. We're going to be discussing various topics that relate to mental health. We're going to have some specialized guest speakers in those areas as well to tell us about their experiences and their expert opinion on mental health in certain populations. So I think altogether, this podcast is aiming to both lower the stigma and then offer some kind of support and perhaps even avenues, resources for mental health care for those who are interested in continuing.
Yeah. We're really excited to see what's in store for ACMH in 2026 because if we could achieve as much as we did last year, I'm just really excited to see what the future holds. And some of these episodes, so we decided to do this podcast just so as we're doing research, as we're learning about things, we're actually talking about it very openly. So there's a lot of like transparency in terms of what we're working on, the way that we think, the things that we discover through the research, through articles that we read, and also inviting specialists of their field who are also Albanian to come talk about topics that maybe it's not an area of expertise of ours. And some of these episodes we'll do in English, like the one today. The ones that are more relevant to the diaspora, we'll do them in English with Albanian subtitles, just in terms of accessibility. The ones that are more relevant to the Albanian community at large, we'll do them in Albanian with English subtitles. So we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And also, it will depend just on the language comfortability of our guest speakers as well.
Of course. And, as we're getting started, still trying to find our footing in the way that we disseminate this information. So, we're going to have various platforms that we're going to try to post this content on. We'll post below the link to our YouTube channel where you can watch the full length episode, and as well our Instagram page, our website for ACMH as well, and our Spotify link.
And now we're starting a newsletter. So if you're interested in signing up for the newsletter, you can go on our website, acmh.ca. The newsletter will be in both languages as well. So if you're interested in just keeping up with the work that we're doing, any updates, feel free to sign up for the newsletter too.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was a pleasure to do this first introductory episode with you, and I so look forward to releasing the rest of the episodes that we have planned. And I hope you tune in, and I hope you have lots of questions for us so that we can continue to build our Albanian community.
Yes, and if you do have any questions that you want us to answer on the show, definitely feel free to email us through our website or just at admin@acmh.ca, and we'll make sure to cover some of these questions in future episodes. I'm really excited about this initiative, and I look forward to the next episode.
Thank you, everybody.